The very definition of a massively multiplayer online game indicates there are other people in it. However, people have been using the term single-player MMO. But what the hell is a single-player massively multiplayer online game? Sounds like a contradiction, but it's actually pretty simple. Does it play like an MMO? And can it be played single-player? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 single-player MMOs you can almost play for endless hours. Now, to go into just a little bit more detail before we get going, we're focusing on games that are not MMOs, but can be played like them. Also, obviously, as I said, endless hours. You can waste a lot of time on the games we're going to talk about. That's kind of important here. There are a lot of actual, real MMOs that are perfectly playable solo, but that would make this a little too easy. We're talking MMO-like games with an offline component. So no Final Fantasy XIV, no Genshin Impact, no Path of Exile, not even Diablo 4. If it can't be played fully single-player, i.e. without connecting to the internet, we're not talking about it today. So with all that in mind, let's get going, starting off at number 10 with Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning. If you want to know the platonic ideal of a single-player MMO, it's this game. These days, it's more famous for nearly bankrupting the state of New Jersey, but if you overlook all the behind-the-scenes problems this game had, and there were a lot of them, so good luck with that, but just focus on the actual game, it's actually pretty good. Also, very MMO-like. The art style, open world setting, even the zones look a lot like a traditional MMO and are structured similar too. I mean, just look at it. If you've seen an MMO, there's something here that looks familiar. Honestly, it borrows so much of the mechanics of visual language of the fantasy MMO that there's a false assumption that this game was meant to be an MMO. It was always planned as a single-player game, though. It's just that there was also going to be a massively multiplayer game in the same setting. They were two different projects. To set the record straight, the one thing about the game that isn't your traditional online RPG is the combat, which is action-based and still pretty fun even now. It's an action RPG that's closer to a basic Devil May Cry than anything else, and it works pretty well. The game is quite long and rewards multiple playthroughs, so somebody could potentially spend hundreds of hours with this game if they wanted, even if it does get a little repetitive sometimes. It's definitely an 8 out of 10 type game. Not an all-time classic, but it's really fun for what it is, and it gives you the MMO feeling without having to rearrange your life to become an MMO guy. Moving on to number 9, Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Valhalla. Seems like with Mirage and Shadows, the Assassin's Creed series is moving away from the bloated content stuff monstrosities of the recent past. And that's generally heralded as a good thing, but I don't know, there is something to appreciate how much bang for your buck you get with these games. Out of every game in the series, Odyssey and Valhalla are easily the most MMO-like, but for different reasons. Odyssey often feels like an open-world MMO, with how many parts of the game you travel to a new region, complete a series of self-contained quests, and then move on. Most of them are side quests, have no real bearing on the story. They're mostly there for you to have something to do. The quests are also pretty MMO-like with basic go here, do this type objectives, though they do give you some choices once in a while and are generally pretty fully featured compared to Valhalla's often very basic side quests. Valhalla has less noteworthy side content, but makes up for it with an extremely long main quest that goes on for ages, and then there's all the DLCs that make the game even longer.
The boar.
Seriously, the amount of post-game content Valhalla got was nuts. You got new regions, entire massive expansions, tons of new game modes to screw around in. It's a game that just keeps going if you want it to. It's going to be a common refrain on this list that this stuff gets repetitive after a while, but I mean, I think that's kind of the nature of what we're talking about. And for some people, that's not necessarily the problem. Moving on to number 8, it's Monster Hunter World. It's not really the kind of game you traditionally expect to be compared to an MMO, but look at the details. There's plenty of similarities. The form is different, but the Monster Hunter games are essentially grinding games. You're primarily hunting monsters to gather resources, which you use to build armor and weapons that get stronger, which in turn allows you to hunt tougher monsters, which lets you get better armor and weapons. The cycle goes on as long as you can stand it. There's easily hundreds of hours of content here, and that's not even getting into the late game where things get really grindy. For the types of people who like to min-max and squeeze as much efficiency as possible out of your build, the Monster Hunter series, it's made for you. What's unique about these games is that almost all progression is entirely equipment-based. There's no traditional level system, so you never really get stronger on a base level. It's all down to the stuff you equip. There's a few separate progression systems, but nothing as straightforward as just like putting points into strength and leveling up. It's all pretty different. World remains the most popular Monster Hunter game, but Rise, even being a Switch game or a pretty basic PC port, has a lot of fun as well. If you go back further into the series with like Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, the amount of content can be absolutely staggering, and that's just another game in a long-running series. These games are designed to get lost in, but with the added bonus of actually having challenging and fun combat. And number 7 is Nioh 2, another game that might not scream MMO at first, but the deeper you get into its systems, the more it starts to look like one. It's a Souls-like and one of the best, but if there's one true inspiration for this game and most of Team Ninja's games, it's Diablo. There's randomized loot, a complex crafting system, an in-depth character building system, lots of possibilities for player expression, and a Diablo-like difficulty system where you can keep climbing to harder and harder difficulties, which offer better loot the higher you go. There's even an entire roguelike endgame mode to grind non-stop if you want. It's one of those games that's only just getting started at the 100-hour mark, and the endgame can feel like an entirely different game compared to the one you were playing before. In some ways, Team Ninja, like their games use a similar format, but none of them quite compared to Nioh 2, which I think really pulled off the formula right. Basically, all their games are good, though, and all their modern games have the same loop of ever-increasing difficulty to get better loot. For most of the base game, that loot's kind of a nuisance, but by the end game, it's a lot more interesting. Pretty much any of their games will scratch the MMO grinding itch. It just takes a while to get to that point. And number 6 is Final Fantasy XII, The Zodiac Age. This is the OG MMO-like game. It's been praised and criticized in equal measure, but to this day, it's one of the best examples of an offline MMO-type game. The combat system in particular looks the part. It's real-time, with your party standing around and attacking with their active time meter filling up. The difference here is that you can pause the game at any time, select your commands, and your party actually does what you want instead of wandering away all the time or getting killed by, like, a gnoll 100 miles away or something. The game's map is also really open, with a story that can charitably be described as unobtrusive. For someone who's a fan of traditionally story-heavy Final Fantasy games, this game's focus on hunting monsters and exploring side content over progressing an in-depth story is gonna feel wrong, but if you're just here for the MMO antics, there's a lot to appreciate. The Gambit system, for one, where you can program your party to perform certain actions to your liking. It was a revelatory idea that doesn't show up in enough games. Still, it's intuitive and relatively simple to use, but makes it so you can really fine-tune your party to do what you want, even though you don't have direct control over them. The hunts are the stars of the show here. There's a ton of them, and they add a lot to the game. There's a lot of optional super bosses, optional areas, and post-game quests to complete. You can tell where the developers' real interests lie. It's a weird Final Fantasy game, even compared to other oddballs in the series. Well, like basically everything after 12. But if it's your kind of game, there's a whole lot to like. At number 5 is White Knight Chronicles 2. During the late 6th and 7th generations, JRPGs were changing a lot, and not always for the better. As graphics technologies improved and expectations increased for what a premier AAA-type video game should be, a lot of games from Japan ditched the traditional turn-based RPG format to embark on more experimental waters. Some went full action to mixed results, while others took inspiration from the growing popularity of the MMO market. Some games were even hybrids, trying to bridge the gap between the two genres. White Knight Chronicles, a PS3 exclusive, is one of those games. It's got a robust and no longer accessible online component, but you can play it offline. The important thing to remember with this series, though, is that the first game doesn't matter. Like, don't bother with it. The sequel comes with everything that's in the first game. It's the first game and the sequel all in one package, and it's a massive game. If you got a spare PS3, it's definitely worth your time if this is the type of thing you want. Yes, it's locked on the PS3, but at least copies at time of writing are still pretty cheap. And if you want an MMO-like single-player game, this one is absolutely that. Everything about it screams MMO, for the large cities, the abundance of quests, the real-time combat, the silent protagonist. The world's massive, tons of stuff to do in it, and just look at it. If this doesn't scream MMO to you, I don't know what will. It's not the easiest game to pick up and play anymore because the console it's trapped on, but if you got a PS3 and haven't played it, it's worth a shot if this is the type of game you like. The sequel fixed a lot of the problems of the original and makes a pretty worthwhile experience. At number 4 is Dragon's Dogma 1. Yes, Dragon's Dogma 2 is the new hotness, but for this entry, let's focus on the original game, which for whatever reason had a lot of MMO-like aspects that were altered for the sequel. Some things are the same, like the pawn system lets you roll around with AI-controlled party members. That gives the game the feeling of being in a group in an MMO, but in an offline setting. Combat obviously doesn't feel too MMO-ish, but the class-based skill system lets you build your character in a number of ways. There's a ton of basic online game-type quests to waste your time on. There's even a raid boss. There's this enemy called the Dragon, which is essentially a 100-person boss that you fight solo-ish, sort of. Like, actually, how this works is that everyone fights this thing on their own, and the amount of damage they inflict is added to the grand total along with everyone else's. So taking this thing down is a collaborative effort, even if you're not really playing with anyone else. There's also Bitter Black Isle, the closest thing the game has to an MMO-style dungeon. It's long, it's difficult, it's designed to put your high-level party to the test. In many ways, Dragon's Dogma is actually nothing like an MMO, but in a few ways, you can clearly see how the developers were influenced by MMO design, even if the game was always meant to be single-player. It's an odd hybrid that doesn't always work the best, but it's such a satisfying game that's different enough from the sequel that it's worth going back to, even if you've only played Dragon's Dogma 2. And number 3 is Grim Dawn. The ARPG genre is perfect for the list. You'd be surprised how many of these things are offline only. Diablo 3 has offline, but only in the Switch version, while Diablo 4, easily the most MMO-like of the series, has no offline mode. There may be some wiggle room here, but instead of trying to figure that out, let's just talk Grim Dawn. It's a Diablo-like, well, technically it's more of a Titan Quest-like, being that game's spiritual sequel. So it's got the loot, it's got the grinding aspect down. Another thing that makes it feel more MMO-like is the large interconnected world map that remains pretty static rather than being randomized. There's also a whole reputation system where you can curry favor with different factions. Feels right out of World of Warcraft, where you do certain things for each group and they'll reward you for increasing your rank with them. It's still an ARPG at heart, so the real focus is killing monsters, but there's a whole lot of other stuff going on to keep you busy if you want. It's mostly, I think, maybe down to aesthetic. Diablo combined with Cosmic Horror is a pretty winning combo, and the Diablo-like combat's pretty solid. But what keeps me and other players coming back is a lot of the other stuff. It's a game that you can spend days on if you're not careful, and unlike most of the other games in the genre, it can be played entirely single-player. And number 2 is Sacred 2, yet another kind of Diablo vein type game. But even compared to Grim Dawn, it's extremely MMO-like. What makes it different? Mostly the world. Grim Dawn's map is big and interconnected, but it still basically follows the standard formula of splitting the map up into different acts, so progression is basically linear. Sacred 2 throws all that out the window with a fully explorable open world. You can go in pretty much any direction you want and just see what happens in this game. It's got tons of quests, the world is huge, you're given tons of skills to customize your character. Is it janky? Absolutely. And in comparison to other action RPGs, it's got a lot of issues, but it's so big and unique that it absolutely deserves a shout out here. The setting is just, it's one of a kind. The game is extremely long and there's a good selection of unique classes here, so it's a game that's easy to get lost in once you're used to it. And finally, at number 1, the Xenoblade Chronicles series. The developers behind the Xenoblade series have not been shy about their MMO influences. The very first game was consciously designed as sort of an offline MMO, with a skill bar that looks right out of basically any online RPG. The maps are absolutely huge. There's a metric boatload of quests in the games, with extensive post-game content to boot. The games generally feel like an Asian MMO because the gigantic environments that are scaled for large groups. It's also got gigantic enemies and sometimes an absurdly busy UI. All these games are good, with Xenoblade Chronicles X being the most MMO-like of all of them, but that one's locked to the Wii U, and it's also kind of the weakest game in the series for a lot of reasons. That doesn't mean it's bad, it's actually a pretty interesting game, even if I would recommend the first game's remaster and the third game over it pretty much any time. Unlike something like Final Fantasy XII that's been kind of bare bones feeling with the not online stuff, every single one of these games, barring the X, feels complete, with a long and satisfying story and a huge world to explore. Loot isn't exactly the game's strong suit, I'll say. The character building is, though. So if you're a number junkie, there is a bunch of stuff to keep you busy. These are just overall really solid games, and if you've got a Switch, you can play them all except, again, X. But if you have to play that one, then there are ways to do it if you're so inclined. They're all interesting games in their own right and are all individually quite long, so there will be plenty to keep you busy.
There goes the enemy. Lord! It's me, you won!
You're a great help.
There goes the enemy.
I'll have your opponent. I'm the big help.
It's me, you won! Great help! That was not sorry!
Victory came easily.
I do have a bonus game for you as well, Crosscode. This one's brought up a lot with offline MMOs, and while I like the game, I think it doesn't quite fit the criteria. Like, it's set in a fictional, futuristic, massively multiplayer game, but the actual gameplay is more like Hyper Light Drifter or Zelda, like a console action RPGs with a few nods to online games. Doesn't really play or look like one at all. There's a lot of fetch quests, though, and for whatever reason, the game is shockingly long, with an extensive post-game, but it's just not like everything else on this list. It's kind of a regular game, like not super MMO-like, even though the setting might make you feel like it is. And again, it does get mentioned a lot, so I figured decent to mention it, but with some caveats. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications. And as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter, Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time right here on gameranx.